Hello, welcome. Hope you're doing good. I wanted to make a quick video talking about whether or not you actually, really need to take a super high dose of creatine in order to get all of the sort of brain health benefits that there are proposed to be. I've had a number of different clients and friends and family for that matter ask me about this. And if you go on social media and see anything related to creatine, this is all anyone is talking about with regard to creatine these days, and the idea that you need to take super high doses, and if you do so, that you're just going to be smarter. There's all these sort of brain health benefits that you're going to get. And honestly, I just disagree almost entirely. I don't really see anyone challenging this. Well, not the idea. I don't disagree with the idea that there are these sort of cognitive and brain health benefits and things of the like. I just disagree with the fact that you need to take a super high dose of it in order to get them. And again, no one is really challenging that idea. And I don't think the evidence for the idea of there being a requisite high dose creatine for the brain health benefits, I just don't think there's a good, strong evidence base to support that. So wanted to make a quick video just sort of explaining why that is. I'll first talk about what the rationale is for why people would say you need to take a high dose of creatine in order to get these benefits, because it's not implausible, the reasoning. And then I'll afterwards speak about why I disagree with it. And there's a number of different studies and research papers that I'm going to speak to and probably reference as I talk through this. I'll link those all down below so you can look more deeply into those if you'd like. In any case, though, the first paper that really started this whole creatine brain health craze was a paper out of some German university, 2022 or 3, I believe it was, where they basically had two groups of subjects. One was given a placebo, one was given creatine. Neither group was taking creatine before this, so they didn't have any sort of augmented creatine stores within their muscle or brain or anything like that. The group that was taking creatine was given a 25-gram dose of creatine. And then the placebo was just some white powder that looked like creatine. The researchers then kept these subjects up pretty much all night and then gave them these sort of puzzles and cognitive challenges throughout the night, and then measured how they did, the time to completion of these various tasks. And the group that took the creatine did significantly better than the group that did not take the creatine. And I forget what the sort of time difference was between when they took it and when they started these tasks, but I do remember there was enough time for it to uptake into the brain and whatnot. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with creatine supplementation in general. If you're, in this space probably decently well, the most commonly used dose historically has been 5 grams per day, with the reasoning behind that being that 5 grams per day will saturate your muscles with creatine reliably. And these researchers in Germany gave their subjects 25 grams in one dose, which is 5x the dose, significantly greater than your usual dose. So part of the argument for why a high dose of creatine for brain stores to saturate is commonly talked about is that the brain requires a certain transporter, a creatine transferase 1. I believe there's a CT2 as well, but I think CT1 is the main one to the best of my memory, that is required to transport creatine across the blood-brain barrier. Otherwise, creatine has no way to get into the brain. It can be produced within the brain itself to some degree, but not to a significant extent. This transporter, CT1, we will call it for the remainder of this video, is not in super high supply and is also downregulated in response to exogenous creatine supplementation. So in other words, when you supplement with creatine, your body will produce less of this CT1 transporter in order to maintain some sort of balance. So part of the idea of high dose creatine supplementation is pretty much just to override this, to take a sort of battery ram to that transporter and just supplement with so much creatine that it just doesn't matter, that it's going to get in there some way, shape, or form nonetheless. And that's where, typically you hear the dose 20 grams per day, 10 grams per day, something like that talked about. And there are short-term duration studies where this higher dose creatine supplementation does saturate brain stores of creatine better than lower dose, like your more typical doses, like 5 grams per day. However, when you expand that out to something like 8 weeks, which is usually the most that, most researchers can get subjects to agree to participate in a study, the effects tend to sort of even out between the higher dose and the lower dose supplementation. So for instance, in regard to the sort of brain health spectrum, one of the proposed benefits is in regard to mood disorder. So when you look at something like major depressive disorder, these individuals are commonly demonstrated to have lower amounts of creatine saturation within the frontal lobe, the front part of the brain. And when you give these individuals either 20 grams of creatine per day for 2 weeks or 5 grams per day for 8 weeks, the saturation of creatine within the brain in that part that is a bit lower than the frontal lobe tends to end up being the same. And that's important because creatine is not a supplement you take for a period of 8 weeks and then you're just done with it. If you want the benefits, you take it for the rest of your life, ideally. And if it is the case that if you zoom out over a long enough period of time, which it does seem to be the case, that the lower dose is going to give you the same sort of saturation as the higher dose, then I don't necessarily see the rationale for the higher doses. If we go back to that study that was done in Germany, where they gave the subjects the cognitive challenges, whatnot, throughout the night, some will argue, somewhat reasonably, that the high dose of creatine that was given, the 25 grams, served to supersede that limited uptake capacity of the brain, of the creatine in the blood-brain barrier, in order to give it saturation. But you could also just call it a really expedited loading phase. So again, I don't know how familiar you are with creatine supplementation protocols, but with creatine supplementation, historically, there's been this idea of what's called a loading phase. So creatine has no acute effect. It's not like you take it 30 minutes later, something happens. It has to saturate within the tissues in your body in order for it to have its effect on those tissues. So when people start supplementing with creatine, they don't necessarily see strength improvements for 2 to 4 weeks after they begin doing so, because it has to take that time to saturate within the muscle. What you can do, though, in regard to muscles at least, is take a higher dose for a shorter period of time and get that saturated effect much more quickly, and therefore see those strength improvements much more quickly. So going back to the dose of 25 grams, that really could be just a really expedited loading phase. And so, I think you would have to see a group that was given 5 grams over a period of 5 days. So the overall amount of creatine that was given is the same, and then see if there's any difference between those two. And I just honestly don't think that there will be. So to try to summarize everything I've talked about here, because I've had no script for this video. I usually do, but I just sort of rattled this one off. Within research, there's this idea of the hierarchy of evidence, which basically just says that there are various different study designs. Not all study designs are equally weighted in terms of how much import you give them, how strongly you can draw conclusions from them. And more often than not, the purpose of the lower level studies is to lead into and justify the execution of the higher level studies. Broadly speaking, you can bracket some study types into mechanism based studies and other studies into outcome based studies. So for instance, let's say there's some sort of effect where A leads to B, which leads to C. Let's say A is the intervention and C is what you actually want to happen, like the outcome in question. An outcome type of study would look at the effect of A on C, and a mechanism-based study would look at the effect of A on B, and then you would use that effect to sort of make a guess about what would happen to C. But I hope you can see that if you just look at A's effect on C, that's a much stronger level of evidence because it's just what actually happens. Focusing on creatine's sort of molecular difficulty to get into the brain across the blood-brain barrier is a mechanistic way of thinking through the problem. Whereas looking at whether it's cognitive output or just creatine or brain creatine stores, how saturated they are, is the effective A on C outcome type of study. Every outcome based study where you look at how saturated the brain becomes with creatine compared to when you compare like a low dose over a long period of time versus a high dose for a short period of time, ends up producing the same sort of results. Again, that's if you look at brain saturation or actual outcome of cognitive performance. And again, creatine is a supplement that ideally you're going to take for the rest of your life to really get the benefits for the rest of your life. And if the lower dose, the 5-gram dose, the typical dose, is going to give you those benefits over a long enough time horizon, then I don't see the rationale for the higher dose. And again, you can bring up the sort of limited supply of the CT1 transporter, but that's too mechanistic in thinking and produces nothing but an educated guess. And I find that to be a very weak argument. And I mean, look, creatine is not an expensive supplement by any stretch of the imagination. I get mine from Bare Performance Nutrition. I spend about $18 a month on it. The weight averages out. I take 5 grams a day myself. Another $18 a month probably isn't going to sink your ship, but it is just another thing to think about. It's more burdensome. And if it is possible that there is no extra benefit from doing so, which again is the case I would make, but the case that I think is the more likely scenario, then why do it? Why put yourself through the stress of remembering to do that and taking that much more every day? So hopefully that helps. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, I had no script. I had no ordered thought process to follow for this one. I just try to rattle this off and try to be somewhat comprehensive. If you have any questions about anything I said as I went through this, don't hesitate to drop them down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Again, hopefully that helps, and I will speak to you soon. Have a good one.